I'm going to introduce our next panel, and we're bringing in two virtual speakers in addition to our two live speakers. First and foremost, this session is it has been structured to build off the last panel session where we really talked about some of the need for the facilitators, the barriers around embedding trials in Canada on a very broad basis. And this panel is going to bring some of the experiences with embedded trials alive. And we're very, very lucky to have Dr. John Marshall, who will be chairing this panel. John is a professor of surgery and critical care medicine at the University of Toronto and a senior scientist in the Li Kai-shing Knowledge Institute of Unity Health Toronto. He is the current chair of the International Forum of Acute Care Trialists and past chair of the International Sepsis Forum and the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group, former Secretary General of the World Federation of Societies of Intensive and Critical Care, and past President of the Surgical Infection Society. I hope I've got that all right, John. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. It was quite a title. With him is Nicole Yada, who's the Director of Strategy and Operations for the REMAP-CAP trial, which has been referred to a couple of times over the last couple of days. Nicole is also part of the International Forum for Acute Care Trialists, based also at Unity Health Toronto. Most recently, she was the inaugural program director from the Accelerating Clinical Trials ACT Consortium, which was earlier mentioned today, and managed business development for ISIS. Now, we've got two people coming in virtually. One is Dr. Srinivas Murthy, who is a critical care specialist who also trained in infectious diseases and an investigator at BC Children's Hospital. He's led new high-quality research on COVID-19, which is very relevant for this conversation, to help Canadians and people around the world. He actually is the principal investigator of CATCO, and that is the Canadian Treatment for COVID-19 trial, which evaluated different treatments such as antiretroviral drugs and anti-malaria drugs for COVID-19 patients in hospital. CATCO is part of a multinational initiative called the Solidarity Trial, which we're going to hear a little bit about, which is being coordinated by the World Health Organization and sponsored by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And finally, we welcome Dr. Fahad Razak, who is an internist at St. Michael's Hospital, also part of Unity Health Group, and Canadian Research Chair in Healthcare Data and Analytics at the University of Toronto. He's an associate professor, Faculty of Medicine, and Institute of Health Policy Management Evaluation at the University of Toronto. Importantly, he founded an organization called Gemini, the largest hospital research network in Canada and one of the few examples globally. He was also scientific director of the Ontario COVID Science Advisory Table and co-authored more than 50 science and policy briefs that shaped the policy, public health, and clinical response to the COVID-19 crisis. I welcome all panelists, and John is going to moderate this panel today.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie, for the introduction to all of the panelists. I thought I would start off by just kind of setting the stage here, who we are, how we got here. The latter is the easier thing. The how we got here is that out of the blue, a few months back, I got a call from Anne-Marie and Carol and Barry about this conference, and it seemed a bit strange because I'm a intensivist trauma surgeon, not a colorectal surgeon, and yet it led to a conversation, a Zoom conversation that lasted for about an hour. Very, very exciting conversation to hear what's happening in the field of colorectal cancer and to understand the commonalities that we share as we think about the process of embedding clinical trials. So I come from the critical care, infectious disease, acute care side of things. And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been very much focused exclusively on the COVID-19 pandemic. But we come out of a tradition, I think, in the ICU of clinical research that shares many of the common themes that have been addressed during this meeting and is certainly aspiring to many of the common aspirations, as you heard yesterday morning from Francois Lamontagne. But we do so from a different perspective, and we face a number of differing challenges. First of all, we treat patients who are in an acute, life-threatening situation, who are generally not in a position to make any decisions about their care. They probably are sick enough that they don't even realize that they are at significant risk of dying. And so the burden of illness, at least acutely, falls predominantly on the family rather than on the patient. And one of the challenges of this, of course, has been how do you bring together those people after they've gone through the worst experience of their lives? Generally, they don't want to think about it, or they certainly don't want to relive it, and they may not recall a lot of the specifics. So patient engagement has been really challenging there. We are also challenged because we are not a field that thrives on innovative new drugs that cost a lot of money to the healthcare system and that generate money for pharma. Over the 35 years or so that I've been involved in critical care, we have had one new drug introduced, and that was only on the market for about 5 years. So we do things better by taking very fundamental things, the provision of oxygen, the provision of fluids, the administration of sedatives, how you nurse a patient in bed. We take those sorts of issues and we make progress by learning how to do those things better than we've done in the past. That doesn't bring us pharma partnerships. It doesn't bring us the kind of resources you need to do clinical trials. It has only recently brought us the attention of funders like CIHR. And so we've been very much dependent on our own initiatives to build research collaborations. Canada's really played a dominant role in this. We, about 3 decades ago, founded the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group, which has really been one of the most effective organizations in running ICU-based clinical research over that period of time, but perhaps as importantly served as a model for groups around the world. So there are now 3, 4, 5 dozen different trials groups on every continent of the planet that use this same model of clinicians who are confronting questions based in their clinical practice, who are interested in and passionate about research and want to work together outside the traditional limitations of a research institute, or even potentially outside the traditional limitations of a single academic center to do clinical trials. And it's a transformational model that has given rise to this group called INFACT, which is a network of networks that represents these different groups. In infectious disease, there are similar themes. So in emerging infections, it's not been an area that's had a lot of pharma interest, and so research has been led in a more ad hoc manner and by a group called ISARC, which has brought together networks around the world. So another networks of clinical research networks, and we've been very active during the pandemic. Recovery emerged from the ISARC network. The lead investigator, Peter Horby, is also the chair of ISARC. REMAP-CAP also emerged from a network of network, INFACT and ISARC. So we have been very much involved in this during the pandemic. But I think the pandemic has the recognition that pandemics are part of the process of providing care has really transformed the way we think about research. So during the initial SARS pandemic back in 2003, we found ourselves faced with a new infection that we knew nothing about and very quickly tried to study it, to set up registries to be able to describe the disease. And we failed. We were not able to respond quickly enough that we could in real time understand what that disease was about. And mercifully, it was gone within a matter of about 3 or 4 months. But we learned from that we had to be better prepared to do observational studies for the next pandemic need, which turned out to occur not that long after, in 2009, when the H1N1 pandemic emerged. There were now a number of registries available to do clinical studies to characterize H1N1, and we were able to bring together about 8,000 different patients with that disease around the world and really publish information about what the disease itself looked like. We tried to do clinical trials, and we were unsuccessful in doing clinical trials, again, because you didn't have in place the infrastructure to do that. And to put a trial together takes a minimum of 6 months. So by the time we had the protocols written, we had the funding, we had the all of the contracts and ethics things done, that pandemic had finished. And so in 2011, ISARC and INFAC got together to talk about how can we be better prepared for the next pandemic. And one of the key concepts that emerged out of that is that we needed registries that were up and active in advance of the pandemic, and that led to the ISARC registry that has now recruited close to 1 million patients with COVID-19. We also needed to have clinical trials that were sleeper trials that were ready to go at the time of the next pandemic. And the model for that was REMAP-CAP, which Srin will be describing a bit more. But the idea was that you have to have this infrastructure in place in advance of the pandemic. So we did reasonably well, but if you look at it critically, we did abysmally badly during the COVID-19 pandemic. There was so much more that could have been done to accelerate research and to really bring the information we needed than we were able to accomplish at the time. And so we've recently, with INFACT and ISARC, had a meeting to try to look at the global lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic for the clinical research agenda, at least in acute care going forward. And a number of the similar themes have emerged. So the embedding of clinical trials in practice, the importance of networks and networks of networks, and the need to fund and activate these so that they can have plans in place. The need for global collaboration, because disease doesn't recognize national boundaries. And if you have colorectal cancer in Canada, you're no different from somebody who has colorectal cancer in Mali in terms of the disease and the potential treatments for it. We've also learned the importance of engaging with stakeholders, the public, and really making sure that that engagement is strong. And finally, articulating goals. We heard the figure 7% of patients getting into cancer trials. In critical care, we would be really pleased to have 7% of our patients in trials. The recovery trial recruited about 8 to 10% of people in the UK and was criticized for not doing better. About 20% of ICU patients got into ICU-based trials during the pandemic. In Canada, it was about 2.4% got into REMAP-CAP of people admitted to an ICU. So we just don't have the infrastructure to be able to do better. That notwithstanding, we made some advances that have never occurred in clinical research before. And I think we can be proud of that. But I think we also have to be humbled by how far we are from where we ultimately want to be in doing clinical trials. And that really means a number of things. And I want to just conclude with an anecdote, which I think speaks to one of the critical factors here, and it's the acceptance of uncertainty as a fundamental principle in the provision of high-quality clinical care. So Francois had mentioned the TRIC trial was a Canadian Critical Care Trials Group trial where we asked the question, what should be our transfusion threshold for patients who are in an ICU? We had traditionally used the value of 10 grams per liter for no good reason. It was less than a normal value, but it seemed like a nice round number, and all of us learned to give people 2 units of blood if their hemoglobin fell below 10. So we had a long discussion in the trials group about whether we should give more blood because you might increase oxygen delivery, or less blood because at the time HIV and hepatitis C were problems in the blood supply. So we did a CIHR-funded clinical trial, and at the end of it, we learned that you did as well or better if we withheld transfusion until your hemoglobin dropped down to 70. But while we were running the trial, I remember approaching a woman whose husband was in the ICU and to ask her for consent for him to participate. And I said to her, spent 20 minutes discussing this. And I talked about all of the pros of transfusion, all of the cons of transfusion, and said, at the end of the day, we don't know the answer here, and that's why we want to do this clinical trial. And I was pretty proud of the way I'd kind of presented a balanced picture of what research was and why this was a good question. And I said, do you have any questions? And she said, yes, doctor, just one. Could you find me a doctor who does know the answer? And the truth is that we don't know the answer. It's not my ignorance or anybody's ignorance. It's a systemic consequence of learning is that there's much more that we need to learn. And so I think if we're going to provide the best care we can, we have to figure out ways to embed that provision into the embed research into the provision of that care, acknowledge the fact that we are constantly learning in healthcare, and as a result, we're constantly doing better. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to my colleague Srinivas Murthy. Srin, in addition to all of the other hats that he wears, is actually the international chair of the REMAP-CAP trial, which is a global platform trial that was launched for pandemic preparedness. Srin, the floor is yours.
And thanks, John. And hopefully folks can hear me okay. I apologize for not being there in Montreal. Sounds like it's a wonderful meeting. I'll speak briefly. John mentioned REMAP-CAP, which is a global platform trial and has the acronym randomized E is for embedded. And I think this meeting is largely focused on the embedded aspects of clinical trials and how we can better do them across different health systems. And so we've been running this platform trial for the past maybe 6 or 7 years now. And I'm going to tell the story of 3 cities, Pittsburgh, Kathmandu, and Toronto, about how they've embedded this platform trial within routine care. In Pittsburgh, they have a single large health system, UPMC, one of the largest health systems in the United States, and with hospital and health system leadership and EHR leadership, and so they have a Cerner platform, they decided we're going to put the entire case report form, we're going to put the randomization module all within that Cerner system. And so a clinician who sees a patient, as they're sort of writing the admitting orders for that patient, gets triggered. Do you want to randomize them in this trial if they meet appropriate eligibility criteria? And so the clinician, thinking that they don't know the answer to which antibiotic this patient should get or whether this patient should get a different antibiotic or not, says, sure, it's easy. I might as well do it. I'll randomize this patient. And that triggers a consent conversation that has to happen with the family to make sure that everything aligns. All of the data from that patient gets extracted from the EHR and gets incorporated into a common database for global analysis. It's as sort of seamless as possible in terms of how you've integrated care and research delivery. Then Kathmandu, Nepal, which is also a huge partner in REMAP-CAP. And so what they did about 10 years ago, through some funding from research initiatives like the Wellcome Trust, decided to build a national registry for all ICU patients. And so what they do with this is by hand, they collect on paper case report forms and ultimately onto a digital case report form over the past few years, some demographic and outcome criteria for every patient admitted to their ICU. They use this for health policy, for quality improvement locally, and now through our trial, we've integrated the randomization and integrated the data collection of a clinical trial that's globally relevant onto that ongoing registry. And so that merging of their quality improvement activities with clinical trial and interventional activities has been also seamless, not EHR based. It's still an individual who has to go in and collect individual data points. They don't really have that much of an EHR in that hospital, but it's largely as seamless as possible with ongoing quality improvement ideas. And so when we reflect on what we hope for learning health systems, there's lots of ways that we can sort of think about how that learning happens and whether or not that learning happens seamlessly, like at that UPMC system where randomization is embedded, or sort of somewhat seamlessly, where that randomization and learning happens as part of ongoing quality improvement exercises. And I'll finish with talking about Toronto, or other Canadian sites, where we've tried as much as possible to embed research within clinical care, and largely has failed. And I think the failure is due to a variety of factors, mostly due to health system and health informatics technology that hasn't kept up with a lot of the rest of the world. I'm very excited to transition these next comments after me to Dr. Razak, who will speak about some of the advances that are happening here. But in Canada, we've largely had to be a traditional randomized trial, a separate case report form, a separate database, a separate standalone silo, where the clinician and the research team are as separated as possible, so that we can sort of align with typical practices in Canadian research. And so I think we've got a long, long way to go in Canada to get to that place where we can truly embed research into clinical care and develop that learning health system that we all want and we all need to make sure our health system is as efficient and as effective as possible for everybody. And so we're learning still in REMAP across the world about the best and sort of optimal strategies to embed research in care. I'll pause there because I'm sure there's going to be lots of great conversation going forward.
Thanks very much, Srin. That's a great comment. So I want to turn the floor over to Fahad Razak, who has been thinking really hard about a lot of these issues and the concept of embedding research into the health record in Ontario and perhaps larger. Fahad leads a program called VITAL, which is currently seeking funding through the CBRF BRIF program. Fahad?
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Srin, for your kind words as well. It's really a pleasure to be with the two of you and with Nicole. This is a group of people that it's been the great privilege of mine to work with and to learn from over the last 6 months as we put the VITAL proposal together. And I'm approaching this as a non-trialist. So in my entire academic career, I've been involved in one trial around proning patients with COVID on medical wards. And so I'm really approaching this as someone who cares about health system data and in the optimization of the use of that data. It's really the philosophy of the learning health system, as Srin said. I think an ambitious vision, which has been largely unrealized globally, but definitely unrealized in a Canadian context. And certainly a vision that I think would address a lot of the needs for a future generation of trials that would address, I think, a lot of the shortcomings that we see in the current capacity for trials output in Canada, but also in many other settings. And so first, to describe Gemini, Gemini is a collaborative between 35 large hospitals in Ontario to share patient data. So this is the rich and deep clinical data that's generated as part of routine care. Every single lab test, the vital signs, the medications that are giving, the imaging reports, all of the unstructured text data, many billions and billions of data points, to bring that into a central repository, which we house at Unity Health in Toronto, and then we put onto a cloud-based platform for users across the country or across the world to use. We currently hold data on more than 2 million people in Ontario, and we've gone through extensive processes to ensure high quality data that's ready for research use across a random sample of about 25,000 data points. The accuracy of our data holdings against electronic health record range from 98 to 100%. The data has been used extensively for research studies. It's used in Canada's largest quality improvement program in Ontario, where physicians caring for about 60% of all of Ontario's medical beds use the data from Gemini, individualized reports that they receive to help guide their quality of care. And it's now starting to be used in applications for pragmatic trials and other applications, which I think is where we really want to go. So why is a data set like Gemini, but the larger issue of existing health system data, why is that critical for future trials? Well, as all of you know, and again, saying this as a non-expert, but an admirer of the trials community, trials are very expensive to conduct. They're often not representative of the general population of patients who have a disease condition, and they often take longer than we hoped for to complete. And so the idea of what existing health system data could do is to support each of those three barriers to hopefully improve along each of those three lines. So a pragmatic trial that uses existing health system data would hopefully be more efficient. It would be less expensive to conduct. It would be more inclusive and generalizable, and it would accelerate the pace of research output. Importantly, in order to achieve that vision, you need to have the investment in data infrastructures to harness all of that complex data and make it available to the trialists. So I see the role of people like me as producing infrastructure that people like Nicole, John, and Shrin can use for their studies. That takes investment, and the investment in Canada has been largely lagging what we've seen in other countries, and notably you can see the impact of those investments, especially in a crucible like the pandemic. Importantly, we have the leadership in the use of this data, the trialists, the trials communities, if the infrastructure was available. I think a lot of you have seen a paper that suggests that looked at the systematic output of trialists in Canada pre-pandemic all the way to 2019 and showed that even though we are 40th by population size in the world, we had the third highest output of high impact clinical trials. So this is a remarkably proficient dynamic community of trialists, but they cannot perform that. They cannot continue to perform the way that they have historically without infrastructure to support them. And I think that's where we really need to push hopefully in the short-term investments that strategically are being put together by the government of Canada, by provinces to accelerate the infrastructure to support those trials. So if you look at specifically investments in Canada, there has been, I think, a good thing. There's been a renewed interest in investing in CIHI, which is, again, administrative data. What we really need is some coordinated approach to invest in clinical data. The barriers to that investment, I think, right now are a centralized push, but also the idea that individual healthcare institutions are custodians of data in a way that can also often prevent them from being interoperable. So I'll use the example of hospitals. Hospitals often have a siloed data model. That means that a lot of the data that they hold is not largely accessible for research applications or network-wide studies. And I think the reasons why those barriers are in place are misguided in some ways. There's a lot of interest for executive leadership in the healthcare system around IP and commercialization. I think that's largely not been realized, but it stands as a barrier to the sharing of data. The other barrier often that's cited are areas like privacy concerns or patient or public interest in the use of the data. I think all of you know that surveys of patients suggest that the vast majority of them would want their health data to be used smartly with the highest degree of privacy and protections. They would want their data to be used to advance the kind of care that they're providing. The other barriers are legal and legislative. So I'll use Ontario as an example. We already have some infrastructure from the government to bring complex health system data together, but because of legislative barriers, longstanding, not attributable to any one government, longstanding legislative barriers, even though the data exists, the investment has already been made. The data cannot be used for research. It can only be used for clinical care. That's a legislative barrier that I think represents a general culture of only using the data for a very narrow clinical lens and not thinking about the dynamic research applications that are possible. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Fahad, for that perspective. So finally, I want to call on Nicole Yada, who really brings a very eclectic perspective on this, having worked with ICES, having worked with ACT. She's got a background through the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group, and so really sort of sees the clinical trials research landscape from multiple perspectives, including large data and clinical trials. And Nicole, you're going to speak a bit about some of the barriers that are confronting the trial initiative.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction and what you have positively described as being eclectic, an eclectic background. I think I'm going to bring probably a bit of a kooky perspective here and talk about three kind of wicked problems in integrating research into care, and really with the core theme of prioritization. So the first one being how we traditionally, and Fahad had just mentioned this, how we really divide research and care based on how we see the benefits and kind of the trajectory there. So research very much intended to be for longer term benefits for future patients, whereas care is immediate benefit for individualized patients. And that's something we need to give some thought to. Also thinking about those we include in trials and those that we don't. And I think that there's a big gap there and an opportunity to close that. And then the last one is about outcomes and outcomes that we select and that we predicate things such as value-based agreements on, or even use for in regulatory purposes or studies themselves. So starting with the divide between research and care, I think it's really important to note that from an ethics standpoint, these are two entirely separate fields, and for good reason, right? This dates back to the atrocities of World War II and really the need to actually be protecting patients from research and putting those parameters in place. Versus care, which is quite different, and if we do want to have a learning health system, which I think there is broad consensus on, we actually really need to kind of close that gap and really reframe how we think about protecting patients from research versus working with patients in research. And I think that is something that is more complicated than might come across by talking about embedding research into care. So I was super pleased to hear Stuart mention benefits and how we actually describe that. I think pre-pandemic, the potential benefit that a participant might see in participating in a trial would be very, very future state. Like you may or may not benefit at some point when this paper is published. The timeline to evidence generation that we saw in the pandemic, where patients that are participating in trials are, if they are randomized, just by virtue of them participating, they are contributing to the public knowledge base in almost real time. And I think that the way that we frame those benefits, there's a lot of opportunity there. Anne-Marie had mentioned yesterday about the opportunity to use more marketing principles in how we talk about and recruit patients to clinical trials. And I do think that is a really untapped area. The mode and the method that we deliver the message about the importance of participating in research is really important. The next one about those who are in trials versus those that we are missing or leaving behind. Winston and Kelvin spoke yesterday about real-world data and how those are really typically seen as quite two parallel tracks. And that's a real missed opportunity because there's such a important role for population-based data and the terrific work that Fahad has led from along kind of a trajectory. So if we think about actually measuring the burden of illness and using population-based data to do that can actually inform prioritization for future research studies. We need to also then, of course, use it to serve as kind of a control for some of the clinical trials that we're doing and measuring it against people with the same conditions. And that's hugely valuable to ensure representativeness. Then there is also, of course, implementation science and actually being able to see from the population-based data what some of the barriers may be to introducing some new treatments or therapeutics into the population and actually leveraging that. And of course, the broad equity concern. So I know that Francois had spoken yesterday about and had shown the maps of where burden of illness is versus where research is taking place. And of course, there's huge disadvantages to those that are not participating or having the opportunity to enroll in trials. And then last but not least on my kind of kooky list here is outcomes. And I think that it was spoken about yesterday, the importance of top-down leadership versus bottom-up leadership. And when we talk about deciding on outcomes that matter, whether it's for value-based agreements or for trials or whatever, I'd actually argue that we probably need to meet in the middle. And the importance of multi-stakeholder dialogue like we're having here today that brings together policymakers and clinicians and industry and patients is probably how we are going to get to that consensus about what we should be measuring. I think that having patients involved in that, as Linda had mentioned yesterday, is so critical. Everyone has a different perspective of what is important to measure. My measure of success for this panel was that I did not trip on my way up. I assume that AV has a different measure of success, and Anne-Marie and Carol would have a different one as well. None of those are wrong, they're totally valid, but unless we actually have that open dialogue, we wouldn't be able to kind of unearth those assumptions. In identifying outcomes, I think there's the selection piece and getting consensus on them. There's actually the measurement piece as well. And so in that multi-stakeholder dialogue, I think it's really, really important that we involve the data scientists in that. They can identify what can be measured, and as Natalie had mentioned, what can't be measured and where there needs to be further work that takes place there. There's also such an opportunity with outcomes through routinely collected data to really be reducing the burden on patients in terms of long-term follow-up coming from clinical trials. And that's, again, it's an underutilized opportunity and something that will can increase the speed, efficiency, cost effectiveness, all of that kind of thing for usual trials. So I think that's the end of my list there. I do just want to note again that I think that meetings like this that do bring together these different stakeholders and can force some of these conversations and really spark engagement there is really critical, and probably the only way that we are going to be able to kind of move forward on some of those stickier issues.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nicole, Fahad, and Srinivas for three great presentations. As I've been listening to them, I've been trying to sort of frame the discussion this morning, and a couple of thoughts come to mind, and three themes. One critical thought, though, is that I think we're at an inflection point in clinical research coming out of the pandemic. Governments are recognizing the importance of research and also recognizing how inadequate the research response was globally. And so the Canadian government and through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research has instituted an initiative to try to build a better clinical trials ecosystem in Canada. That is happening internationally. The World Health Organization published a declaration, the World Health Association Declaration on Clinical Trials, calling on member states to build their capacity to do clinical trials. They're holding a meeting later this month in Geneva to discuss this. So this is very much on the global agenda, and I think that we have an opportunity to contribute to that and to really move some things forward. But it's going to require being very clear about what the objectives are in building a better clinical trials ecosystem. So the three themes that kind of stood out to me is, number one, the issue of embedding. We've heard that phrase a lot. It's an aspiration. It's like pornography. We all recognize it when we see it, but we're not quite sure what it is. I think we do have to think more carefully about what are the steps towards embedding. Is it in the initial identification of patients who might be eligible for a trial? Is that something we can do through the admissions process? Is it consent? Can we start an initial consent process where patients are screened about their willingness to participate in clinical trials so that process has been initiated? Data capture, is there a way we could get data systems to talk to each other and overcome some of the privacy concerns that come up? Should we maybe be thinking rather about individual patient randomization, think about health unit randomization, the cluster randomized trial as a perhaps initial step? So I think thinking about how do we actually flesh out the concept of embedding, what are the specific things that we can do to move in that direction. That's one area for discussion. A second one, and I think it's been really key at this meeting, is the importance of recognizing that diseases don't compete with each other, and we don't want to have silos. So how do we get cross-disease, cross-disciplinary collaboration nationally and internationally so that we can sort of speak as a single community who are representing the ultimate goal of improving patient care? And then I think the third one is this question about how do we reframe research? How do we kind of change the dialogue, the ethical dialogue, from protecting patients from research to empowering patients through research? I think there's a lot that needs to be done to do that. And so with that in mind, and I obviously welcome comments as well from anybody in the audience to participate in this dialogue. Perhaps we could start with some thoughts on the specific steps that might be the proverbial low-hanging fruit in embedding research into clinical care. Any thoughts on that? Fahad, Srin, Nicole?
I'm happy to offer some, and I think John, probably a lot of our conversations are Is there one in the audience, or should I continue?
There is somebody from the audience, but
Yeah,
why don't
why
you
don't
carry on, Fahad, and then I'll call on the. Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep mine short because I think that could be more interesting to hear what people have to say. But I do think there's a lot, a lot of the way that panels like this think about the opportunities now are framed by the experience of the pandemic. And if you look at the pandemic and what was most effective, it does give us a bit of a playbook, I think, about where we need to go in terms of the future best case applications and opportunities for this kind of research. And one refrain that you hear often is size, speed, and quality. Size, speed, and quality. And the most important things that came out of impactful pandemic research really optimized along those domains of size, speed, quality. And if you look at, for example, the example of Israel or the United Kingdom, which produced a lot of the leading research that we would often cite and change the way that we practice, they were able to either get research out quickly, they were able to coordinate the questions that were being asked, and they were able to use high quality data to produce results. And so the example of trials from the United Kingdom or observational phase 4 type research from Israel, both of those exploited that capacity. And I think in Canada, we definitely have size if you look at some of our larger provinces or interprovincial coordination. For example, Ontario is 50% larger than Israel. We also have high quality data. I think where we have stumbled is on the coordination and speed. So that's really, if you think about what dimension to push on, I would say that's the biggest opportunity.
Thanks very much, Fahad. I think there was a question or comment from the floor.
I was really, really intrigued by the presenter who mentioned quality improvement and the example that you used there. And the reason I was intrigued, for many of you who work in the healthcare system, who worked in hospitals or community hospitals across the country about 15, 20 years ago, all governments started stating, number one, publicly available safety measures, number two, implementing quality improvement plans, and number three, teams working together with physicians, clinicians, administrators, et cetera, data specialists in creating quality improvement projects as part of those quality improvement plans. So it's something mandated and something that we're all used to over for at least 15 years, if not more. And I really wonder if that example could be used in some of the centers, maybe smaller centers, maybe larger centers, in taking embedded quality improvement teams that already exist in most organizations, including small organizations, who are trained in certain aspects related to that and also usually have some research experience, and looking at those clinical trials that might be able to be embedded in conjunction with some of the prioritization of quality targets that an organization is trying to improve for better patient care. So I worked in quality improvement at the Ottawa Hospital for 7 years, and I would have welcomed so much to partner with people who were trialists to do some of that work. So I just wonder if it's a new concept, or maybe I'm totally ignorant and there's a lot going on out there. So please answer. Thanks so much.
So thank you very much for that comment. If I could just respond to that. I mean, I think it's a very, very important point. And I think one of the key things in clinical research is marrying research with quality improvement. I have 2 comments on that. Number one is that we now have models of research that can do that. The platform trial that uses response adaptive randomization, like REMAP-CAP does, actually preferentially randomizes patients to the interventions that seem to be doing better. So patients are actually benefiting, and the system is actually beginning to incorporate that information as the trial goes forward. That could actually, in theory, in a platform trial that uses response adaptive randomization, the standard of care for everybody else is the findings of that particular trial. There is a caution, at least coming from the critical care field, where we've spent the last couple of decades putting a lot of energy into quality improvement programs, instituting interventions that actually prove to be harmful. For example, tight glucose control in the ICU. Turns out if you try too hard, people die. Oral rinsing with chlorhexidine turns out to be not beneficial, but actually slightly harmful to patients. So I think it just underlines the importance of not making the assumptions that we know what the improvements are that need to be made, and that we need to be thinking about models that marry the two. Yes, it's Mike here.
Thank you very much. These are all really excellent presentations. I really want to respond and enhance or second the concern that Fahad described in terms of the kind of siloing of data information into institutions or even into provinces. And I think this is something that we really have to find a solution for, because I think, and it probably has to be a top-down process, but we are going through a series of, at the federal level, at the provincial level, major funding for projects that along with that include building a database, but don't require that they do an environmental scan and fit in an interface at the very least, if not integrate with the existing databases. And I think this level of fracturing exists even down to the level of the patient advocacy groups. I think with the era of precision medicine, there isn't breast cancer. There's 5 or 6 subgroups of breast cancer. Some of them look like a subgroup of gastric cancer in that they're driven by HER2 overexpression and so on and so forth. So we have to move beyond competing for limited resources by virtue of tumor type. Are we going to have now 5 different breast subtype groups, support groups competing for and talking to ministries about drug approvals, et cetera? So we have silos up and down the pathway here of participation and of the work. And I really think that has to be now a line item in funding and in project management and in project planning. Just as we have a paragraph on IDE now that we all sincerely believe needs to be there, we need to start to include a paragraph on where does the database that I'm building fit into the rest? How can it fit with the rest so that as a whole we're much stronger?
So that's an excellent point. I mean, certainly in COVID-19, our most effective therapies come out of the field of rheumatology. We wouldn't have anticipated that. Srin, you got a comment? I think.
Yeah, to build on that sort of question, I think there's a movement to that, to do that, to have more sort of standardized data management plans across research groups, across hospital groups, and so on. I'll highlight the Canadian Immunity Task Force during COVID-19, which sort of mandated any data collected would be used across its different silos in a way, so that those silos would be broken down and so that data could be shared as much as possible. Obviously, there remain barriers throughout. To the previous question about quality improvement, and I think there's really exciting movements here. The quality improvement field generated about 30 years ago, sort of as distinct from the clinical research field. And as the years have gone by, they're merging more and more, which is an exciting space to be in. The quality improvement field is embracing the concept of randomization as part of its evaluation of interventions. And the clinical research field is embracing a lot of the quality improvement ideas about implementation science and knowledge translation. And so as we see these fields merge and all the lessons across those two spaces emerge, it's really, as you say, John, an inflection point as to how we can do clinical research and do clinical research better.
Francois.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to congratulate the outstanding panel members. You were all awesome and very well integrated in your presentations. I'm gonna. I don't know if this is going to make sense. I'm going to try to make sense of what I'm saying, but I thought you were well integrated in what you said because, Srin started off presenting success stories and not so successful stories, and the key element here being the embedding, right? So high resource setting, Pittsburgh, embedded technologically, embedded in a lower resource setting quite well. So the technology, the fancy design doesn't seem to be the critical, it's something else. It's like the embedding recipe is, making it or breaking it. Fahad's example in Gemini is an exceptional story, exceptional because in Canada it is an exception, right, of embedding. So the data, Gemini is actually the hospital system data that is used for all sorts of reasons and then used for research as well. So, but it's the exception, right? And it's making that, and Nicole sort of did bring it home by probably explaining how that is. So that, like, this distinction between care and research is probably at the root of all those barriers, right? Legal, ethical, and all those barriers that we as researchers complain about. They're there, perhaps, and then the outcomes and everything else was interesting. But my comment to John's question about what's the low-hanging fruit? I'm not sure it's a low-hanging fruit, but an urgent sort of next step is maybe concept of proportionality, right? And like earlier, for the panel members who are joining virtually, there was a lot of discussion about a clinical trial is essentially beneficial, and someone said, well, you know what? There is an element of risk here. It is an experiment, right? it's not that the clinical trial will always be associated. I mean, and all the data about if you're in a clinical trial, you do better. That's, I think, as a methodologist, highly confounded. If you live in a street that has better pavement, your outcomes are also better. And I think maybe access to critical care might be confounded with other stuff. So, and this is as someone who couldn't be a stronger believer in trials. But I think the real, and the argument that was made by earlier was that the winning strategy is not to sell the trial as can never be wrong. It's usual care. It's so perfectible. And so it's proportionality and literacy and explaining this, right? And just the analogy I'll use is blood thinner is life-saving if you've got a huge clot in your lung, right? There's no question. But there are situations, there are risks. It's not so I don't think we win by making it seem as there are no disadvantages. The real story is there may be risks, and there are legal risks to participate in research. I'm as frustrated or more frustrated by all the legal barriers to linking data, but the thing is there is a legal risk. The question is maybe the disadvantages of prohibiting flow of data are worse than the advantages of accepting some of those risks. So that proportionality of the measures that you take and I don't think that when lawyers tell us you can't share, you can't use the health system data for whatever reason, I think their arguments are not wrong. It's just that I don't think they have the legitimacy to say you cannot do this because they have not spoken with Linda or patient groups or people with lived experience or the public. I think if the public weighed in, the patients weighed in, they would have to be well informed of the status quo and the downsides of being treated by clinicians who will pick something, a blood transfusion threshold, as John was pointing out, that is really arbitrary. They don't know this. They only know about this if there's a study happening, because in my unit, I'm sorry to say, we do a whole number of interventions under the package deal of ICU without getting consent from patients. And so I think it's proportionality, and there are probably cases where all those barriers are really well justified. In other cases, when you're evaluating something that's already part of usual care, maybe there could be leniency with, so I think we shouldn't be talking about research as a single homogeneous entity. There are all sorts of risk levels that can be, anyway, sorry for a long comment. But.
Thanks very much, Francois. Maybe just in the last couple of minutes, I want to just return to the issue about how we can kind of break down the silos between diseases and how we can better work together, and maybe even ask Barry for his perspective on this. It does strike me, Francois, as you were talking about proportionality, years ago there was a report that aspirin, if you took an aspirin, you reduced your risk of colorectal cancer. And I thought, look, aspirin's safe, so I started taking aspirin. Back around the year 2000. Well, in REMAP-CAP, we also discovered that if you take aspirin when you're in the ICU, your survival at 6 months after COVID-19, after being in the ICU with COVID-19, is improved. So a drug as simple as aspirin has activity in preventing colorectal cancer, maybe. I mean, that study has been called into question. But it does speak to both to the issue of proportionality and the need to stop thinking within silos and to be thinking more in a more Catholic manner about the cross-fertilization that we can get from this. Barry, how do you bring our different worlds together? You've done a magnificent job with this.
First of all, that was not a plug for one of our sponsors, I am sure. Aspirin.
It was a plea.
So I went on aspirin too, and at one of our earlier conferences at McGill, we had somebody come up from Vanderbilt and talk about COX-2 inhibitors and using NSAIDs and so forth. So I did do that without thinking about a randomized trial, just based on these anecdotal stories. Ultimately went on Vioxx, and when the data came out on Vioxx, that kind of closed down that door, not to Cetuximab, not to Celebrex, but to one product. So the clinical trials, on one product versus another product really didn't tell the full story, and they've never really told the full story on aspirin, right? So that's it. Now, how to tie it all together? First of all, congratulations for Pittsburgh, because that's where Sarah is from, just coincidentally. So it was nice to hear to tie that in together. I would say the real tie-in is the experience that you have had on using data that came from the embedded trials or the embedded work that you've done. I was, pretty, notwithstanding the failure that we heard about in Toronto, I think that having a failure is not what one wants, but is good because it helps us to understand where the weaknesses are in our system if we are going to have embedded trials or embedded research in our daily practice. So I think that this all comes back very often to the word data. We've heard a lot about that yesterday in our panel, and we've heard about Gemini and so forth. So, the importance really, whether it's in critical care or cancer or any other field, is really this important work that's being done or just beginning to be done in Canada to link data between centers and hopefully between provinces as well. So when we hear the great work that's happening with Gemini, I ask myself, well, okay, well, what's happening in Quebec? What's happening in Manitoba and in these other provinces? And if we are a small country of, relatively 38 million people, which is a nice database as a whole, but we suffer from these inadequate databases in each province. So if I were to tie it together, I would say it with one word: we need better access to data and more easy access to data. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in Canada is actually legislation which might inhibit at least the thinking of sharing of data. Last year at our conference, we heard from Alan Forster and others who were working on the data strategy, Eric Sutherland and so forth, who were working on the data strategy in Canada. They said, actually, it's not the legal part that's preventing, it's the protectionism in each institution and unwillingness to share data. And so I think that comes back to what we were saying before about this need for cultural change in the way that we handle data, in the way that we share data, so that we can all, benefit, whether in critical care or in cancer or other fields as well.
Thanks very much for that. Nicole, did you have any last comments that you want to make?
Sure, just picking up on that, and I think some of the, or your earlier question, John, about the low-hanging fruit. I don't know if it's low-hanging fruit, but there has been a number of comments made about recruitment rate into clinical trials. And in my view, if there is a low-hanging fruit, it's actually getting a better understanding of what that is. I don't think that we can currently reliably measure burden of disease and enrollment into clinical trials in Canada. And to really be able to benchmark that and then use that to measure our progress against, I think would be a hugely valuable contribution. I also just wanted to pick up on Francois' earlier comments about proportionality. I think that, I had mentioned earlier the origins of informed consent and why that exists for good reason. Over time, I think that has largely shifted to not protecting patients, but actually protecting institutions. And I don't think that we give enough credence to patient preferences and values for actually the information that they need to understand and the method and the mode that they actually want to be receiving that. I think we do need to really, really challenge some of those normative assumptions about how we communicate complex information to patients to facilitate enrollment into clinical trials, and that really needs a re-examination if we do want to be patient-centered and really be embedding research into care.
Terrific comments. Thanks so much. Srin or Fahad, any last comments? Srin?
No, Nicole summed it up wonderfully. I think we need to think differently about how we have done things over the past number of years. It's an exciting time to truly bring patients, communities, stakeholders, partners, industry, academia, institutions together to build that, as everyone wants, that learning health system. We know where we want to be. We have barriers, whether it's data, whether it's culture, whether it's privacy. We know what they are. We just need to do the work together to get there. And I think it's time to do it.
Fahad, any thoughts? Last
Yeah,
thoughts?
I'll add to the great comments from Shren and Nicole that I do think that a key part of this has to be centralized prioritization of wanting this to happen for our system. So if you don't have a central push that will flatten some of the legislative and perceived privacy or legal barriers, and again, I think they're largely perceived, you'll have institutions continue to fragment, use their own set of rules in a way that all often will boil down to the lowest common denominator of the highest amount of barrier protection, the least amount of research application. Again, I think we can look to the UK as an example of what can happen if there's centralized coordination that overcomes those barriers, both in terms of data flows, but also importantly in terms of prioritizing questions. We're not the largest country, but we have the capacity, I think, to compete against leading jurisdictions globally, but it's going to take a lot of that coordinated effort to do it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to, first of all, thank you so much, Srin, Fahad, and Nicole, for all your great thoughts into this. I'm going to turn the panel back to Anne-Marie.